Okay, the integument. Now, this basically is your first system that we're going to do. So let me just pause this because I'm recording. Let me just pause this 1 second. I'm sorry for the background noise. Okay, so I'm recording again, and the integument is the first system that we do. So this involves all 4 tissue types, which would be epithelial. Just to remember, all these are the questions that are going to be on the quiz, on the exam as well. Epithelial, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. So all of those 3 tissues are involved. And remember the hierarchy, you start with the atom and you go all the way up to the cell, and then tissue, which are these, and then organs, and then organ system. So the integument is the first organ, and it's part of a system. So integument means skin. If you hear the term cutaneous, that means skin as well. And it's a protection. It's a first line of defense. Therefore, it is a barrier to the outside world and everything that comes with that. Visual, like you can look at skin as far as looking for redness, looking for pallor. When you look pale, just mute those mics. And you could see certain conditions based on the skin color, okay? Dermatology, derma is the prefix for the study of skin. Integument, though, also involves your hair and nails, too. And we'll talk about the input of sweat glands and sebaceous glands and oily glands. So we have to identify that. So here's the layers. I try to stay with this like layers, like 3 main layers of skin. The outermost is epidermis, and that's epithelial tissue, the only place where there's epithelial tissue, and it's stratified squamous. So many layers of squamous cells. Dermis is the next layer. That's more dense, irregular connective tissue, like we mentioned before when we did connective tissue. So deep to the dermis, below the dermis, is subcutaneous layer, which is hypodermis. So technically that's the 3rd layer. Sometimes the books just say 2. So there's 1, 2, and 3 layers of skin, basically. And deep to the dermis, you have, below the dermis, you have the subcutaneous. So hypo means below. And that tissue is generally alveolar, which is loose connective tissue, and also adipose, which is a loose connective tissue. So alveolar is loose connective tissue, so is adipose. They say it's not part of the integumentary system, but it definitely is part of the skin. So here's the classic model, and you go in APR and you can see all these things. So now you have the 3 layers. Here's the epidermis, and be careful because the epidermis kind of juts down into the dermis. So these little papilla here are still derma, the dermis, dense irregular connective tissue here. So definitely look at those lines. And there's a papillary layer, which is basically where the dermis plugs into the epidermis. The reticular layer is everything else. You can see that. And the below the dermis is the subcutaneous. So some of the things you're going to need to point out on the test. First of all, I think the thing that really shows here is your hair follicle. Right? You see this whole structure is a hair follicle. Here's like an example of one. There's a couple of hair follicles. Notice that this one over here is cut in half, like this is the outside of the hair follicle. And attached to the hair follicle is usually this big gland here, and that's called a sebaceous gland that secretes an oily substance called sebum. So sebaceous gland is attached and dumps its exocrine products into the hair follicle lumen. The erector pili muscle, notice that right here, that's a smooth muscle. So that represents the muscle. And the erector pili is what contracts and gives the appearance of goose flesh. So it basically helps the sebaceous gland contract and release its products, but it gives you goose flesh. We don't have feathers, so there's really no reason for goose flesh, right? Here's your epidermal ridges that goes into the dermal papillae. And that's the papillary layer of the dermis, really. But notice that connection. That's really the point. Now you can see other glands, like a sweat gland could be called eccrine or merocrine sweat gland, depending on which one you're pointing to. For our purposes, you just have to know that this is a sweat gland, not a sebaceous gland. But there are different types of sweat glands based on location in the body and based on hormonal release. But most of the sweat glands we're going to see are eccrine, which are to release water in times of increased body temperature. You can see the red arteries and veins, and that's the vascularity. So the dermis is very vascular, but the epidermis is avascular. There's no blood vessels in the epidermis, if you notice. So we're going to go through, there's 4 to 5 layers of epidermis, and we're going to call them strata. So we'll go through them soon. And you can see the sweat glands have pores above the epidermis, and ducts. Sweat gland duct is coming from the gland itself, releasing the water to the external surface. And you can see the hair shafts. Below the skin, it's called hair root, and the hair follicle is this one big area right here. And I'm not going to go too deep into the hair follicle, but you'll see it when we get through the PowerPoint. Now there's nerve fibers, it's mostly yellow in the dermis and part of the epidermis. You see these sensory nerve receptors, and that's all you have to say. Like this one is encapsulated, so it's a little more sensitive to deep touch or pressure. But really, you could just say sensory nerve fiber for those structures. And here's your areolar connective tissue and tactile sensory receptor. So you could say sensory receptor, you could say sensory nerve fiber, because you can see there's some up by the epidermis, and most of those are for pain and temperature. And the ones that are deep encapsulated, like Pacinian corpuscles, they're more for deep pressure. And these are mostly sensory. Like this one is motor. You don't have to worry about that, because you have to have some nerve direction to the erector pili muscle in the sebaceous gland. Here's some adipose. Remember, adipose is a big part of the hypodermis, so subcutaneous tissue. Sometimes we call that sub-Q. Okay, how are we doing so far? Any questions about that? So go through your checklist and get the main parts. I might not have named all of them yet, but we're going to continue into the PowerPoint, and I'm recording, so you'll have all of this before the test. Also, when I say layer, I'm generally talking about the epidermis and dermis and hypodermis. But later on, I'm going to be talking about the strata of the epidermis. And in thin skin, there's 4 layers. In thick skin, there's 5 layers. So I'll go through that with you. So let's hit this back up. See what's next. And here I may have mentioned before that the most important protein in the integument is keratin. So the epidermis is made, especially the outer layer, is keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium. And here's the strata. I'm not even going to say layers. I'm going to say strata. Strata means layer. So these are in thick skin. There's 5. There's only 4 in thin skin. So thick skin means the palms of hands and soles of the feet. Well, there really isn't a lot of hair follicles, but there's thicker skin. So this stratum, lucidum, is the one that's added to these 2 places in thick skin, palms and soles. So the rest of them now this is from the inside out, from the bottom. So right above the dermis, you have stratum basal, which makes sense, the base right above the basal. So there's a basement membrane where you have some cells. They look cuboidal, but ultimately the apical surface on the outside is going to be squamous. So that's the bottom area. The next one is spinosum, probably the biggest layer of the, until you get to the top. But let's talk about that. I always like to do it this way. Let's start again. Stratum basal is the bottom. next to the dermis, and stratum corneum is the top. Now, in some histology, that looks like the thickest, and that's where most of the dead squamous cells are with the keratinocytes. They all have keratin. So the bottom is basal, and the outer part is corneum. So going from the bottom, the next one would be spinosum, which the cells are kind of spiny looking, and then a thin layer called stratum granulosum, and that has little granules, which is most of the time is keratin coming out of there. And then we have lucidum, which is only in thick skin. So it's kind of translucent. It's like a whitish, clearish layer of cells. There's still keratinocytes though. And then the corneum is mostly a thick layer of dead cells, many layers. So the stratum basal is very thin, very small. It looks cuboidal, basement membrane. Spinosum is bigger, probably the biggest up to the corneum. Granulosum is dark staining. Lucidum is very light. And then corneum is the dead cells on top. Very squamous looking. So stratum basal is important. Here's where you have your melanocytes, which contain a protein called melanin. And this is a pigment that protects us actually from UVB radiation and UVA radiation. And there's keratinocytes here, and tactile cells are sensory. When you hear tactiles, touch. So sensory cells, nerve tissue. So melanin is important, again, for protection, but it also gives you the pigment. And the problem with melanin is prone to change in DNA, which could lead to something like melanoma. Okay, but there are basal cells, and we'll talk about cancer later on, but basal cells are the bottom, and we need a picture. I know we need a picture soon. So this is continuing. This is where most of the mitosis takes place in the stratum basal. I don't want to go too much into this, but just so you know when you see it, because it's mostly going to be a visual. Keratin, again, only in the skin. You don't see this anywhere else but in the skin. And it's everywhere in the epidermis. Remember, we're still talking about the epidermis. And now we're going to move on after this slide to the stratum spinosum, but let's just do a little bit more. Again, you don't have to know all these things. This is more of a lecture. Merkel cells or nerve tissue, and there's a lot of touch receptors, and that's really what we're talking about here in the stratum basal. But really, it's not even telling you, but one of the main things that happens in the epidermis, especially in the stratum basal, is synthesis of vitamin D. And you need vitamin D, especially vitamin D3, to absorb your dietary calcium in your small intestine. So that's really important. That happens in the epidermis, actually, in the sun. So the sun could help you, but it could hurt you by causing cancer. So that's why melanin is important to protect you. Spinosum, we have some macrophages there. That's what epidermal dendritic cells means. Langerhans cells are macrophages. Hopefully you remember what that is, the big eaters, right? This is your second line of defense. Eating and engulfing, big eaters, right? Derived from white blood cells. So Langerhans cells or macrophages are important for immunity. And you'll see that, again, you need a visual, and we'll get that soon. This granulosum is very small compared to spinosum, the stratum. And you see a lot of keratinization because you see the dark staining keratin in the nuclei or in the cytoplasm, of the stratum granulosum cells. And they're starting to die as you get to the surface. This one is the one, make a note of this, is the only one you see in thick skin. Thick skin is the palms and soles. And the protein is called elidin. And that's a clear protein, only seen in the stratum lucidum, which is the fifth layer in thick skin. Most layers, thin skin, everywhere else has 4 layers. And this is the outermost. This is many layers. So technically this is the biggest ones, but they're mostly dead cells. So this is really about protection, right? Remember when we did epithelial tissue, you had to know what it looks like, what's its function, and where in the body do you find it. So this particular layer is a perfect example of keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, which is for protection. Where do we find it? Because it's keratinized, we find it in the epidermis, specifically the stratum corneum. Okay. So here is the real anatomy. You look at this today in your APR, you have to really take a look at this, because these are the pictures you're going to get on the exam. This is just a cartoon over here. So this happens to be thick skin because it has the stratum lucidum. So again, I look at the bottom layer first, stratum, sorry, the stratum basal. Remember, everything else is dermis. Like right here is dermis. That's the dermal papilla. That's dermis. It's really areolar connective tissue there in the papillary. This is the dense irregular connective tissue here. So above that is the 5 layer, in this case, 5 layers of stratum of epidermis. So I would start with the basal. Is really small, like you can hardly see it right here. You can see it here in the cartoon. And then the next one up is a larger group of cells called the stratum spinosum. So you have to really look at this. And then you can see the dark staining stratum granulosum. And then this big dead layers of stratum corneum. So this is all stratum corneum, all this. This is dermis. This is dermis. Be careful. This is stratum spinosum, and basal is really small. So really take a look at that in APR today. So remember, thick skin versus thin skin, and the one layer that's there. So this is thin skin. It doesn't have the stratum lucidum. So this one, check it out. It's got a huge stratum corneum. So even the picture, if you saw it before behind me, is actually thick skin, I believe. It has all the stratum. This is thick skin here, actually. Here's thick skin. And this is thin skin, so no lucidum. Notice that the lucidum is between the corneum and the granulosum. To take a note of that, where it is. Because you don't have it here in thin skin. You just have, this is a really good picture of stratum basal. This is all connective tissue. This, even right here, is dermis. Then stratum spinosum, granulosum, no lucidum, and then the smaller looking corneum. This is a really thick corneum. You see that? Thick skin, which makes sense when you think about the soles of the foot and the palms of the hand. Makes sense, right? How are we doing? Okay. Any questions about that? So just to review, you have your checklist. Before we go into the lab, we'll look at the APR. Just so you know, the general parts of the integument, the hair follicle, the sebaceous gland, the erector pili muscle, and then the layers, epidermis, dermis, hypodermis, and the tissue that's in all of those. Don't forget the sensory receptors that are pretty much placed throughout the whole integument. Okay, and then do your strata. Know the strata of the epidermis. That's all epithelial tissue. So the outermost is called corneum. The innermost is called basal. And then you have the spinosum going up, and then you have granulosum. And then you have corneum. That's the 4 layers of thin skin. Thick skin has the extra layer of lucidum. And notice in the picture that we showed you that the thick skin has a thicker stratum corneum. So any questions there? All good? All right, let's move on. So these are basically proteins that are in and pigments too. They give you different colors. Like hemoglobin is a protein that carries oxygen in the blood cells. So that can give you a color, increase in hemoglobin, which is a good thing, glows red, especially when it's binding oxygen, of course. Melanin is a pigment, and it's a dark pigment. So the more melanin, the darker the pigment, or the skin, or the eyes, or hair. Right? It's important, melanin in those tissues. Albinism is a problem with an enzyme that produces melanin ultimately. from amino acid because the melanin is a protein. And so are enzymes. So again, that's a problem. Albinism is absolutely no melanin, very dangerous because the glare in your eyes would be very, very dangerous. And the protection of your skin would be gone from the UV radiation. Carotene, based as vitamin A is based on beta carotene. It's a yellow-orange pigment acquired from some vegetables. Again, I'm not going to ask you things like that. We really just have to look at the cells. So inside the cells, like you could see, there's some melanin, like the stratum basal has that melanin pigment. So if you see a close up in the APR, the melanin is mostly in the stratum basal. Okay, and remember, just make sure you know this is still dermis. Stratum basal is the one layer or two at the bottom of the epidermis, top of the dermis. So go through that list. These are just some things that can happen. These are fingerprints are basically folds of dermis and epidermis. Like those dermal papilla will give you the friction ridges, which show up as fingerprints. Which look like the swirls, and we're not going to go into that. I don't think your lab really goes into it. But your lab will go into some burns, which is important because it helps you understand the layers and strata of the skin and how it affects it. So the dermis is deep to the epidermis, and it's mostly CT proper, which is generally areolar on top and some in the papilla and dense irregular connective tissue in the dermis. So most of the dermis is, especially the reticular layer, is mostly dense irregular connective tissue, where the papillary region is mostly areolar. And again, sebaceous glands, you saw that in the dermis. All the goodies are in the dermis. The hair follicles, and you'll see nail. I'm not going to talk much about nails and hair, but we'll talk mostly about the skin. And the erector pili, remember, is a smooth muscle that when contracts will give you that goose flesh. And look for those nerve endings in the lap. So papillary layer versus reticular layer. Again, you need a picture. So here's the papillary layer of dermis. Now that's part of the dermis. Reticular layer is the rest of it. So the reticular layer is mostly where the dense irregular connective tissue is. And look, it kind of like the way the epidermis locks into these dermal papilla, the epidermal ridges, and that's what gives you the fingerprints. So again, epidermis, all epithelial tissue. Dermis, connective tissue, especially dense irregular connective tissue, which is really like leathery. That's really where the leather that we use for clothing actually comes from the cow dermis. And then you have the subcutaneous layer. Subcutaneous layer or subcu or hypodermis is the same thing. Let me just write that. There's hypodermis. And that's made of most loose connective tissue, like areolar and adipose. And it's all very vascular too, like the hypodermis and the dermis are vascular. A lot of blood supply. See, the red is arteries and blue is veins. Where the epidermis is avascular, no vascularity. So again, review, you can see the nerve endings, you can see the capsulated nerve endings. You could see the erector pili muscle, the hair follicles, the hair bulb you'll see in the APR. This is a sweat gland. This is a sebaceous gland. So the sebaceous gland is attached to the hair follicle. And you can see the receptors, and it's pretty good. So we can go back and take a look at that later in the APR. Tension lines are basically the lines you see, in people's skin segments. Pretty much like the palms of your hands are pretty easy to see tension lines. So this is important, like for surgery. Like if you're going to have surgery, sometimes they like to cut along the lines to leave less of a scar. And again, I'm not going to ask you questions about lines of cleavage, but just as you're going through there, so you know what's going on. So here's about the subcutaneous layer, also known as the subcu, hypodermis. I like to call it subcu. And it's technically not part of the integument, but it's important. And energy storage in the form of those triglycerides in the adipose. Definitely that causes insulation too. But I think number one, you're going to say protection. And a common in drug injection site, which we'll talk about in a minute because we have some nurses in here and we'll just talk about that. Let's just get in your face. Okay, so are you guys with me? And girls? Anybody with me? Anybody here?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's play a little game, I guess, kind of. Let's say we're going to take a needle, right? A syringe, and we're going to go, we want to get to the muscle. I'll even make it a little harder. We want to get to the muscle. We want to do an intramuscular. Remember, intra means within, inter means between. So what's the first strata we hit when we inject into, say, somebody's shoulder? What's the stratum? The outermost layer of epidermis. Come on, let's do it. Come on. You can use your notes or your book or your PowerPoint. What will be the first strata? Begins with a C.
Is it the corneum?
Got it. Very good. Very good. And then what would be the next stratum? And remember, this is thin skin, so there's no lucidum. What would be the next one?
Would it be the starts with G?
Granulosum. You got it. Granulosum. Remember, you have to fill these in on the exam. Like you have to write it out. So you might as well use your checklist to write them out. So, so that's very good. So corneum, granulosum. What's the next one? Begins with an S.
Spinosum.
Spinosum. Great. Excellent. And then you, the last one in the shoulder, thin skin.
Basal.
Basal. Very good. So now we're through the epidermis. And then we go into the dermis, right? Correct? Yep. And then what's the next layer, sort of, below the dermis? What could you say you go through next? What do I call that?
Hypodermis.
Hypodermis or subcutaneous, yeah. And then below that would be your muscle. And then you could inject intramuscular. You understand? Now, what if it was subcutaneous? Where would you stop? Like you're doing insulin, say, into your stomach area, not your stomach, but into your skin above your abdomen. Subcutaneous, you stop, you go through all those again. You'd go through corneum. Well, first of all, you'd say you go through epidermis. So you'd go through stratum corneum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, stratum basal, through the dermis, then into the hypodermis, which is subcutaneous, and you inject there. That would be subcutaneous injection. Does that make sense? Helps you with the layers and strata. So again, you have to kind of memorize them. So let's see, just so at least you have an idea where we're going with this. And in the lab today, you'll have practice. Okay. So again, the functions of the integument kind of, it makes sense, right? And protection for sure, and keeping the temperature homeostatic and protecting from the mutations from UV radiation toward DNA, keeping yourself hydrated and not dehydration, right? Water resistant, not waterproof, and keratin has a lot to do with that waterproofing, or I should say water resistant. Again, water loss, temperature control, and metabolic, really important because you're making vitamin D3, which is a precursor to basically a hormone that helps you absorb your dietary calcium and some phosphate, right? Calcium ions, which are really important for blood calcium, bones, blood clotting, nerve conduction, muscle contraction, right? And phosphate, very important. Secretion, getting rid of things. So we're not going to talk much about that, but in absorption, immune function, because you have those Langerhans cells, which is our second line of defense. Like your skin is your first line of defense. This oily sebaceous gland, sebum, is a first line of defense, really. Temperature regulation, I think we got that down. And then don't forget sensory reception. Innervation means nerve supply, sensory nerve supply. So we have tactile sense of what we touch, heat, temperature, cold, tickle, fine touch, crude touch, vibration, all of that. Okay, and the hair follicle, we'll get a close look at this. You have some pictures of the hair follicle. And the erector pili muscle, that gives you goosebumps. So this is kind of a close-up of the hair follicle here. And this is melanin as well. They have a cortex is always the outer part. This is the hair bulb. I like to call this the hair bulb down here. That's his hair bulb. And the hair is growing within that bulb and shaft. And then the shaft goes above the skin. So take a look at that in the APR with specific hair follicle photos. And functions of hair, not that important, but I think you get it. You don't have to know any of the hair growth stuff. So this is pretty much just extra. Sweat glands, merocrine and apocrine. So merocrine are more the eccrine about releasing heat through the loss of water. That's merocrine. So it's more clean sweating, mostly water, right? Not so viscous. So it's about thermoregulation. And you can see them on the models, the sweat glands. Apocrine are more puberty sweat, right? And it's more in the underarms and other areas of the nipples, the pubic region. And that's more viscous. So again, this is to do with hormonal release. So it's more during puberty, different type of sweat and nervous sweat too. It's not about thermoregulation. And the sebaceous glands we saw, so you'll be able to identify those. Holocrine gland means like a big part of the gland actually is secreted along with the sebum, or within the sebum. And it's function lubricant, but also it's immune, bactericidal. It's a first line of defense. And the macrophages, the dendritic Langerhans cells, are a second line of defense. Okay. And they're activated more during puberty. So usually when you have acne, skin conditions, blackheads, it's and bacteria that gets into the sebaceous glands, which are part of the hair follicle. Cerumen, this is earwax. It's called cerumen. So there's ceruminous glands. They're really just modified sweat glands. Mammary glands, same thing, produce milk. We'll talk about that in reproduction. They're modified sweat glands as well. Apocrine, though. Apocrine, not merocrine. Merocrine or eccrine are all about releasing water, thermoregulation. So here it is again. You go through this and look at the glands. You could see there is an apocrine sweat gland here, but you don't have to know that on the exam from me. You just have to know sweat gland. That's fine. Because you have enough to worry about with the sebaceous gland. You have to know what a sebaceous gland is versus a sweat gland, and the erector pili muscle, and the nerve endings, the blood vessels, and of course the layers, epidermis, dermis, hypodermis, and then the strata, the 5 strata of the epidermis. So I mentioned acne. Again, there's not really much we're going to talk about as far as tissue repair. This APR animation will go into the burns, and you don't have to know the rules of nines for the exam, but you should know what a 1st degree burn is, and that usually involves just the epidermis, like a sunburn. 2nd degree burn involves the epidermis and part of the dermis. And these are very painful. 3rd degree burn involves all 3. And usually this is not as painful at first, because the nerve endings have been destroyed from the chemical burn or the fire burn. And there's no more receptors, so there's no pain at first, but when they come back, it's extremely painful. Now, you might go through the rule of nines in the APR animation, but I'm not going to ask that on the exam. So just learn the 3 1st degree burns, what layers they involve, 2nd degree burns, and 3rd degree burns. This is just some treatment. Develop of the Integument, we're not going to do. So this is with aging, like just like anything, you have reduced number of mitoses and reduced number of stem cells. And collagen goes down. Remember, collagen is a huge part of connective tissue, especially in the dermis. So you lose that elasticity when the collagen is less. You get more wrinkles because the crease lines forms as the protein decreases. So of course it gets less elastic. And there's less immune response because the Langerhans cells and dendritic cells are going down too. And the hair thins out and turns gray because you lose the melanin. Makes sense, right? So skin cancer, especially one of the biggest causes of skin cancer, is UV radiation. That's why the sunscreen and the melanin is so important. Botox is a bacteria, actually, Clostridium botulinum, which actually just stops the muscles from contracting. It blocks the nerves, the acetylcholine, actually, of the facial muscles. So they decreases wrinkles. But yeah, this could be good for smooth muscle too. Like people who are constipated, people have headaches. It's not just cosmetic Botox. So if you have any questions, you could ask me about that. Okay. And I think that's basically it. We'll go through your APR together a little bit today just to help you out what you need. But it's relatively straightforward, this lab, as far as it goes with the exam 1. So that would pretty much be everything we need to do.